This is my 67th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This will just be a fairly short video dealing with a number of repairs and touch-ups to rolling stock that I needed to do. For the most part, this will be a follow-up dealing with items that have already been seen in previous videos which needed further attention. Back in part 64, I covered in some detail the work I did on a Dapol Royal Scot locomotive that I picked up with some coaches on eBay. The most significant operational repair that I had to do to that loco was to replace the gear on the main driven axle, as the original gear was badly worn and not engaging properly with the gear passing drive from the motor. To do that, of course, I had to completely take apart the driven axle, and the parts are seen here. The connecting rods were linked with the wheels by crank pins that were simply pushed in rather than screwing. The crank pins can be seen at top left here. As you can clearly see, they're just short metal rods with flat heads with no kind of thread or other shaping. Here is the driven axle with the wheels assembled onto the new gear. You can see clearly here the attachment for the connecting rod. The hole on the end of the connecting rod fits over that protrusion on the wheel, and then the crank pin pushes into the hole in the protrusion to retain the connecting rod. Here's the chassis reassembled, with the connecting rod reattached to the wheel with the crank pin. And here's the repaired and also renamed and renumbered loco on the layout. Now, the loco ran quite well like that for a while. There's quite a bit of video of it running in my previous part about how cameras for shooting running video on the layout could be set up. But as I was shooting one of those videos, the loco, pulling the 3 coaches that came with it when I bought it, was just passing through the station at the back of my Hornby layout when it seized up and stopped. I really had no idea at first why the loco had stopped. My first thought was just that it had been going quite slowly and had hit a dirty place on the track, losing connection. So, after turning off the camera, I gave it a little push. That seemed to make the motor turn a bit, but the loco still didn't move. So then I thought that it had probably hit some piece of debris on the tracks and derailed. It didn't help that the loco was right at the back of the layout where it was hard to get at. I leant over with the idea of re-railing the loco, and I saw that one of the connecting rods had become detached. Uh-oh, not good. So clearly one of those push-in crank pins had come out and fallen off, allowing the connecting rod to detach from the wheel. I was rather afraid that something like this might happen. I'd pushed the crank pins home as best as I could, but I wasn't very confident about them. Now, I'd have shown you the video of the train running and seizing up here, but I seem to have lost it somehow. Maybe in my concern about the loco, I somehow didn't save that video properly. Anyway, it seems I don't have it. At that point, I had to search for the crank pin that had come out. I was not at all sanguine about this. Trying to find a tiny metal crank pin somewhere amongst the ballast and static grass on my Hornby layout was not a good prospect. I was seriously dubious as to my chances of finding it, although it would certainly be on the layout somewhere, as there was no way it could really have got off. Anyway, to cut a fairly long and somewhat stressful story short, I did manage to find the pin. I tried extra lights and magnets, but eventually I found it simply by leaning over the board and peering closely. It was only about 12 or 15 inches back from where the loco had seized up, amongst the ballast between the 2 tracks in the station. Now I had to try and repair the loco. The wheels had shifted on the axle and were no longer quartered properly. The wheels were just pushed onto the axle with no glue. That was how they were originally, and I left the wheels on the replacement axle that way. The fit seemed to be tight enough to allow the axle to drive the loco fine when everything is assembled properly. But with one wheel being attached by a connecting rod and the other wheel not being attached, the wheels had shifted out of their quartered position on the axle. So I re-quartered the wheels, still without gluing. Then I needed to reattach the connecting rod. It seemed to me that even when I pushed the crank pin in all the way so that the head of the pin met the fitting on the wheel, the pin still wasn't firmly fitted and was probably just going to fall out again. This surprised me a bit, as when I first took the pins out I had to use quite a bit of force to lever the pins out of their fittings, so perhaps the pins were originally glued in? I really don't know. But I resorted to gluing the pins into the fittings on the wheels as part of this repair, as that seemed the only likely path to having them stay in place. I put a tiny drop of CA glue onto the very tip of a toothpick, and then I worked that glue into the hole in the fitting on the wheel, hooked the connecting rod over the fitting, and then pushed the crank pin in. Of course this was tricky, as I wanted the pin to be firmly glued into the fitting, but I mustn't get any glue onto the connecting rod, or it wouldn't be able to turn freely as it must do for the loco to run. I did this for the pin that had come out, and for the pin on the other side. I only did this for the pins on the driven wheels. The pins on the other wheels I had never taken out, and they still seemed to be firmly fixed in place. Whilst working on this loco again, I noticed that the coupling on the tender was broken. Its hook was still okay, but its loop was completely broken off. It would still couple so long as its hook engaged a loop on the leading piece of rolling stock, but I thought it should be repaired. So I fitted a new coupling. These are the standard Bachmann wide-loop couplings, of which I had spares on hand. Here you can see the unboxed Wagons that I purchased from British Model Trains and brought back recently from the Kitchener Train Show. A couple of these needed some work. The ladder on this tank wagon was broken. It was supposed to curve around, providing access to the top of the wagon, but it was actually just sticking straight up from the base of the wagon with its top attached to nothing. I wasn't surprised that the ladder should break, but I was surprised that it would spring out pretty much completely straight. To repair it, I had to bend it round the wagon and attach it at the top. Given its strong tendency to spring straight, this was difficult to do. I eventually managed by forcing something of a bend into the ladder, which was made of flexible plastic, and then attaching the top with CA glue and holding it until the glue set. I was fairly pleased with the result. You can hardly see where I've glued the ladder at the top. This wagon came with no couplings. I knew this, as it was clearly stated in the listing by British Model Trains. It's apparently a kit-built wagon that had never had couplings fitted to it. I glued in place these Pico coupling mounting blocks, of which I had a bunch on hand. And then I fitted Bachmann couplings to the coupling mounting blocks. These couplings have holes in the middle so that they can be screwed in place, but in this case I just glued them to the pins on the mounting blocks. This is an old Triang sleeping car which I bought on eBay. It isn't really quite right for an LMS sleeping car, but no company has ever made a ready-to-run LMS sleeping car in 00 gauge. There have been a couple of kits, but I haven't been able to source an unbuilt kit. I've seen a couple of kit-built sleeping cars for sale, but they were asking over £100 for them, which seemed too steep to me. So I decided I'd just cobble together my own approximation to an LMS sleeping car. Many of the LMS sleeping cars were 12-wheeled with 6-wheeled bogies, similar to the 68-foot dining cars, which can be bought ready to run. But the LMS did also use 8-wheeled sleeping cars. The Bluebell Heritage Railway has an example. This car came to me with paper routing labels on it, quite nicely done, but obviously not appropriate for my LMS use. So I removed the routing placards by scraping the paper off with a thumbnail. And then I cleaned up any remaining glue with a cotton bud dipped in mineral spirits. I used HMRS press-fix transfers to apply LMS markings to the coach. I did look at pictures of actual LMS sleeping cars. I put the LMS coat of arms in the centre between the words of sleeping car. LMS lettering was applied at one end of each side. Coaches of this type might have been more likely to be single class, but given the short trains I would necessarily be running on my layouts, I wanted any sleeping car to be composite, so I put 3s on the doors at one end and 1s on the doors at the other end. Here's a closer view of one end with the third-class door. And a close-up of the LMS insignia. Not perfect, but the press-fix transfers do quite a good job of these. And here's the other end with the first-class door. And here's a non-flash view of the whole coach. A little bit of a bodge, I guess, but I think I'll still enjoy running it. Whilst I was dealing with all the other issues with the Daypol Royal Scot, I noticed that some of the paint was missing from the front buffer beam. I hadn't noticed this at first, but when I did notice, I thought I'd better try to do something about it. I had picked up a bunch more old polyscale paints at the Kitchener train show, giving me some more choices for colour. I touched up the buffer bar using ATSF Red, which I had previously for the lower bright red, and Tuscan, which came in the box from the Kitchener show for the upper dark red. The result is not perfect, but it's a pretty good fix that should look okay from a normal distance. I find that these old polyscale acrylic paints generally work okay after a good stirring, even when they are old and have separated out. Now, I just wanted to do a little video of that rolling stock running on the layout. Following on from my previous video about camera options, the last segment I shot there was done with my Moto G Power Android phone, and with an LED reading light clamped on the tripod for extra light, as the phone seems to need tons of light to shoot clear video. Well, the LED light I used is actually a reading light that I usually keep clamped to the headboard of my bed, and I didn't want to keep moving it back and forth, and anyway it wasn't ideal as a video light, so I ordered an LED ring light intended specifically as a video light, about $30 from Amazon. And you can see that here, clamped to the tripod. It came with the clamp. This light is not bad, probably better than the reading light I was using before, but I think the phone would really benefit from even more light than this can provide at its maximum brightness. It is dimmable, and it also supports white, warm and mid-temperature modes. For the following video I had it on maximum brightness mid-temperature mode. As an aside, I did spend some time reading up on dedicated video cameras, but it seems that the more reasonably priced ones tend to be fixed focus, intended more for shooting action outside or shooting people, and they probably wouldn't be ideal for the kind of close video of small things that I'm trying to do on the railway. So for now at least, I guess the phone is my best option. So now let's just see a little video shot with the phone like this of the repaired and refinished rolling stock on the layout. Okay, let's see if I can try to run this stuff on the layout. Now, trying to run these large passenger trains is very iffy, quite honestly. It's going the wrong way. This engine can hardly manage to pull these carriages, and they look kind of silly going around a tight bend anyway, and then they may or may not get round the bend at the other end because of that confounded fence, which especially that very long sleeping coach is prone to hitting. Oh, and now I think the engine is derailed on the point. Well, it struggled to get over the point, actually. I think it managed to rail itself again. Well, there's the sleeping coach in the middle of the train. And where else are you going to put it? Although I suppose, I don't know, can people pass right through it without disturbing the sleepers? I suppose they can. Okay, well, let's try and, famous last words, draw that away. You get some wheel slip with it on there. And we'll put that train for now. I'm just going to put it back in the station. And we'll see if we can bring the wagons round. And here's those two wagons that I just fixed. The LMS coal wagon and the Anglo-Scottish Chemical Company wagon. The couplings on them are a bit iffy, but they can be made to couple. This train will hopefully be a bit more reliable. It's running on the inner line, which in any case is less troublesome with fences and things, and in any case goods trains just run easier because they're shorter. You know, you've not got the long vehicles to worry about. So it's a lot easier to run goods trains than it is to run passenger trains. Let's push my luck and see if I can bring that passenger train back again, but whether it'll get back successfully is kind of iffy, I'm afraid. I think we made it. Bring the sleeping... famous last words, I stopped it too soon. Go on. Bring the sleeping car back there. Into view. Even back it. There we go. So there you go. Okay, one more little video experiment. I remembered that I also had this camera, a cheapy little action cam that I bought from TomTop several years ago. It has never really had much use, as its form factor didn't lend itself to being mounted on an RC aeroplane, and I found that the Mobius worked fine as a hat cam. This says 4K on it, and it can nominally shoot 4K video, but I'm sure it doesn't have a true 4K sensor. It does have a couple of points in its favour. It seems to be able to record things quite close to the lens without going badly out of focus, and it has a 720 pixel 60 frames per second mode, which I thought might help to capture moving trains with less motion blur. It came with a transparent case that can be used to mount it to a tripod or a cycle helmet or whatever, but if you put it in the case, then it can't record audio. There's no tripod mount hole on the camera itself, but being a simple box, it can just be stood on things, as here, just put down on the tracks. So let's see if the 60 frames per second mode gives better video of a passing train. I've removed the sleeping car from the train, as it's extra long and wasn't running all that well, could perhaps do with some work on the bogies, and I didn't want to be worrying too much about the actual running of the train as I was doing this experiment. So here we go. So, still quite a bit of blur even with that 60 frames per second, but maybe it's worthwhile to use for shooting the passing trains.